The next forest that we have is the West Coast Forest. In our book, it's labeled as the West Coast Forest, and by Society of American Forestry standards, I believe they refer to it as the Pacific Forest. This area stretches from British Columbia in Canada down basically along western California through the Coast Range and up through, of course, Washington and Oregon through the Cascade, Cascade Range and west of there, and then also the Sierra Nevada Mountains in eastern California. Your principal species, they're going to be very large conifer trees. That's kind of the big thing with this area. You're going to get your redwood trees, your Douglas fir trees, trees that grow for hundreds of years and get to be 100, 200 feet tall. In the case of redwood trees, 300 feet tall. The tallest redwood tree in the world, Hyperion, is 379 feet tall. So extremely, extremely large trees. Other species, western hemlock, western red cedar, giant sequoia, really big trees growing in the Sierra Nevadas, and not far from here. You can get to giant sequoias, the Trail of 100 Giants. You can get there in about a couple hours from Bakersfield College. Another species that comes from this area is Monterey pine, which is interesting because Monterey pine is in the area that it's native to is actually not that big of a commercial species, not a hugely important species, a decent one, but not hugely important. But for New Zealand, it actually got taken to New Zealand, and it has become a huge commercial species. Grows really well in New Zealand, and it's actually their most important commercial timber species is Monterey pine that comes from this West Coast forest. So this is the region over here on the left of your map that we're talking about. So looking at it by the Society of American Forestry standard, we'd have the North Pacific and the South Pacific. The North Pacific, we'd be talking about that British Columbia, Washington, Oregon area. Whoops, let's bring that back. Sorry about that. So your major species there: Sitka spruce, western hemlock, western red cedar, Douglas fir, redwood trees. As we get into the South Pacific, so talking about the Sierra Nevada mountains and kind of the more what we'd see down on kind of the west coast, but farther south, in terms of like the transverse mountain area, Sierra Nevada mixed conifer in the Sierras, which is really an important dominant cover type because it's, in terms of conifer trees, cone-bearing trees, the Sierra Nevadas has the most diversity of any area in the world in terms of how many different conifer or cone-bearing trees it has. Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, similar species we saw in the western interior forest. California black oak is one hardwood species that dominates this area because it dominates in the foothills leading up to the higher elevations. And then Jeffrey pine, which is similar to Ponderosa pine. So in the northern Pacific, we got Douglas fir here on the left, Sitka spruce right here in the middle. Sitka spruce is actually an important species for making musical instruments. A lot of musical instruments are made of spruce. Western hemlock, known for having a droopy top. And hemlock needles, when you touch it, they fall off the branch real easy. Western red cedar, which is what pencils are made out of. And so this is number 2 pencils. Doesn't seem like that would be a great use. There's other uses for western red cedar, but number 2 pencils is one of them. Incense cedar looks a lot like redwood and a lot like western red cedar. It's another species you'll see in these forests. And then redwood trees. And right here, this is a picture of Hyperion. So these, you can see all these other conifer trees below it, and then you can see this massive redwood tree. This 379 foot tall redwood tree. It was actually taller, but the top broke off. So as last I checked, it's 379 feet tall. So in our South Pacific Forest, or southern part of our redwood forest, we got ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. We got our Sierra Nevada mixed conifer, so all sorts of different conifers in there, including giant sequoia. And then our California black oak down in the lower elevations. This is in the Yosemite Valley. So the history of this area, in 1920, the West Coast would come to lead the nation in timber production. From 1905 to 1938, in fact, Washington was the leading state, would lead the nation in timber production. Now Oregon leads the nation in timber production. Georgia has the most acres for timberland, but Oregon, the forest industry in Oregon is extremely huge. In terms of Douglas fir, gets used a lot for lumber, plywood, pulpwood, poles, and pilings. Pilings being these right here, where they are pilings are just poles, except they're placed upside down. Oh, I confused it. Sorry, I said western red cedar was Pensil's incense cedar. We get the number 2 pencils out of western red cedar, roof shingles, decks, decorative fences, boxes, coffins, siding. Have I made a couple mistakes during this lecture? Absolutely, but when we're talking about, all the forests in North America and all the different trees, sometimes you get, you mix a few up. So, hopefully I will not have that happen anymore. This area produces one third of the nation's timber. So even though it's actually our smallest region in size, the West Coast forest actually produces a third of the nation's timber. So a lot of timber production happening in a small area. And it also helps that the trees that are getting cut down, because even if there's fewer trees getting cut down, because it's not as much private ownership as in the other areas, you're cutting down really big trees, so you can get a lot out of an individual tree. The other thing, though, is that with the West Coast forest as opposed to the interior forest, you do get a lot more industry out here. So we don't have those non-industrial private forest landowners, but there's a lot of areas on the West Coast that are actually owned by industry. So that we talked about kind of the main areas within the lower 48 part of the United States, but we're going to also talk about Alaska. We're going to also talk about Hawaii. We're going to briefly touch on Puerto Rico, and then we'll talk about Canada and Mexico to kind of finish it up. So with Alaska, you have 2 forest regions. You got the coastal region where you got about 7 million acres, and you've got established industry, and then you got interior, which is about another 4 million acres, but it's limited by weather, transportation, pests, and fire. And because Alaska is so huge and it's so hard to get to some of these areas along the coast, different story, easy to get to, established transportation areas, used quite a bit. The interior, not as much. Your principal species, mostly western hemlock, some Sitka spruce, and then western red cedar is used for pulpwood. So really only growing small trees in terms of western red cedar. In terms of Alaska, up there you have 104 million acres of federal lands. A lot of this is in national parks and wilderness areas and areas where we're not going to be doing any forestry. So when we're talking about that coastal area, we're talking about this area down here along the coast where we get the forest. Up here is our interior area, much more remote, much harder to get to. Here's just some pictures again. So here's Sitka spruce. There's our western red cedar again, western hemlock. These are all species we've kind of looked at before, all conifer species. And so our next forest is the tropical forest. So we got our Hawaiian forest. We got about 2 million acres of wet and dry tropical forest. So a lot of people just always think about tropical forests as being wet, but there are dry forest areas as well. I did a study in the British Virgin Islands where it was a island in the tropics, but it was dry. There was cactus growing on lots of different places on the island, and not a lot of trees. So it really kind of depends. Hawaii is an extremely diverse ecological environment. There's 2,200 native plants on the island. 97% of them are endemic to Hawaii. They're only found in Hawaii. But Hawaii is also covered up in exotic species as well, because it's out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and used a lot for both tourism and as a kind of go-between between Asia and North America. So it's one of the things I've always found interesting about Hawaii is that because it has so many exotic species, it's used a lot in films because it can be anywhere, basically. Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park, Jumanji, all sorts of movies have been filmed out in Hawaii because it can be anywhere, basically, because it's covered up in exotic species. Macadamia trees are also grown on the island, mostly focused on the idea of the agriculture of the macadamia nut. Two big species that are grown in Hawaii are the Ohia liua, which it's a pioneer species on lava flows. It's used in flooring, pallets, poles, and posts. And then koa, which is similar to black walnut, which is a important species in the central forest. And koa is used in paneling, furniture, cabinets, and I put rings at the end here because my wedding ring is actually made out of koa wood. So here's our islands, our Hawaiian islands, and we can see our forested areas within each island. We can see on the big island of Hawaii, the youngest of the islands, just in case you don't know how that works. The smaller the island, the older it is. So Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii, is actually the newest of the islands. So that's where we get the majority of our forest. We can see on Maui we've got some, and Oahu, and then a big central forest on Kauai as well. So on our left here, that is koa, and on our right, that is Ohia liua. And you can see it pioneering, just shooting right up through the lava flows. And then another picture of Ohia liua where it isn't just pioneering on lava flows. It does grow it doesn't have to be just that pioneer species with a disturbance. So another place where we get tropical forest is the southern tips of Florida and Texas, but the area we're going to focus on next is Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory. The whole island was completely forested at one point. Only about 15,000 acres have been unmodified. So really the majority of the island has been cut down and used at one point or another. Their second growth forests are starting to return now. You got about 40% of the island that is covered with second growth forests. You got about 500 native trees on the island of Puerto Rico. Their two biggest species are Spanish cedar and Lignum vitae, and you also have the Caribbean National Forest on the island of Puerto Rico. And so here's a look at Puerto Rico, and really I want you to focus on this land cover 2000 at the bottom of this graphic, and you can see that forests are that dark green. So we can see the dark green areas on the island, and we can see about 40% of the island is forested. To the left of your screen, we've got Spanish cedar, and to the right is Lignum vitae, and up here, these are the leaves of Lignum vitae. And now let's go from the tropical, warm, humid areas of Puerto Rico to the cold and frozen areas of Canada. So here is Canada's forest regions, and you can see the boreal forest. That biome is the dominant area up in Canada. We do get, we talked about it with the West Coast forest, where we got British Columbia, where we get some of this this montane kind of more temperate forest right here, but the majority of Canada falls into that boreal forest region. So forest covers 3/4 of Canada, including 860 million acres overall. 93% of these forests in Canada are publicly owned. 77% of it's owned by provincial governments. Instead of states in Canada, they have provinces, and so 77% of it's owned by the provinces. And this has led to a softwood or a conifer dispute with the United States that we'll talk about. So your principal species up in the boreal forest, you got jack pine, balsam fir, black spruce, tamarack, aspen, and paper birch. The boreal forest, Boreas, was the Greek god of the north wind. That's how we get the name boreal forest. It's one of the world's largest biomes. The boreal forest is about 6,800 miles across the northern hemisphere, and we talked about it. It's you can have it at the top of the Appalachians and southern Rockies, but then mostly this big swath of Canada. Another word for boreal forest is taiga, and taiga is the Russian word for marshy pine forest. The characteristics of this biome: cold climate, low rate of precipitation, short growing season. Temperatures can get really cold. Frost will usually cover up this region, and most of the taiga is permanently covered in water, so you get that permafrost, similar to tundra, but you've got trees growing in this area because of the temperature difference. And you don't get a lot, as much diversity of animal life as you do in a temperate forest, or tropical forest, for that matter. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about boreal forest. Lots of conifer trees. You do get some hardwoods, but mostly dominated by large conifer trees. So the U.S. and Canada have had a lumber dispute over softwood or conifer trees, mostly over dimensional lumber, because the majority of Canada's softwood is owned by their government. And so whenever the industries in the U.S. here are trying to kind of raise prices or trying to sell more timber than Canada, what happens is that Canada can always sell it at a lower price because it's all owned by the government, and they don't have to meet certain profit margins, so they're able to undercut the price. And so if you're saying, well, but why doesn't Canada use its own wood? Why doesn't the United States use its own wood? They do. The problem is all the other places in the world that they sell to. So, selling to China and selling to Brazil and selling to Russia, who does have a large forestry industry as well, selling to Europe, all these different places that are going to have some sort of a need for this wood that grows here in North America and doesn't grow as well in some of these other places, and certainly not in the large numbers that we have it here in North America. And so it's become a long dispute. It's still a dispute. It's stuff that even the Trump administration, the current administration, has tried to deal with these days. But the U.S. isn't happy about it. Canada's not happy about it. But hopefully one day it'll be resolved in just getting to some sort of an understanding that hopefully that there's just kind of enough wood and enough demand to go around. Mexico's forest. Mexico is a mountainous country. It's got a wide range of climatic and ecological zones. They have government restrictions on the sale of timber. You only get 1-year contracts. So you can get multiple year contracts because here in the United States, because you never know like what might happen. You'll get some set period of time to go be able to cut it down. But in Mexico, you only get 1 year contract. So if there happens to be, you know, some great huge event or something that happens to where you can't go and get that timber, then too bad. Your contract runs out and somebody else can then buy it the next year. Mexico's forests are mostly dominated by pine trees, a little bit of fir, and then mahogany and other hardwoods really make up the rest of the forests. And then certainly, as with all parts of Latin America, even we talked about it earlier with Puerto Rico, you do have some deforestation issues, but the government is trying to prevent that from happening. I like the idea of talking about the Mexican forest, because I think a lot of people, when they think of Mexico, they don't really think about it as a forested area. But when you look at this map, it really helps paint the picture that the majority of the country is forested land. A lot of tropical rainforest, some just temperate forest when you get kind of that, this is that continuation from the western interior forest of the U.S. through the Rocky Mountains, which then become the Sierra Madres down in Mexico, and that temperate forest, but then transitioning to a rainforest. And what I just think is really interesting about the Mexican approach is that the people get the forest. So over 70% of Mexico's forests are managed by communities within the areas where the forests are. Logging permits are over 8 million hectares. They supply 80% of the country's timber. So the majority of timber for the country of Mexico comes from these Mexican forests that are managed by these communities. So they're able to keep the money in the community and really make the forest work for them within the community. So it's just something that I find really interesting. And so that's the North American forest. I know it's a lot of information to try and take in to really understand everything that's going on down in the forest, all the way from Mexico all the way up to the forest in Canada and everything going on in the U.S. But that's kind of the whole point, is that there is a lot to forestry. There's a reason why it's a science and why there's so much into it, and why we have a whole degree about forestry. So I hope you enjoyed it.